Welcome to Murder Midnight, a crime storytelling channel for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. But before we close our eyes and start, please comment what country you are tuning in from. It will greatly help us here at Murder Midnight. Okay, let's start with the first story. The Purple Conspiracy, Constantinople, Byzantine Empire, June 532 AD, Logothete. John the Cappadocian stood at the window of his administrative chambers in the Great Palace, watching the smoke still rising from the Hippodrome, where the Nika riots had finally been suppressed just days earlier. At 52, he served as Emperor Justinian's chief financial minister, wielding power that made him one of the most influential and hated men in the Byzantine Empire. The riots had nearly toppled the government, and only the ruthless intervention of General Belisarius had saved Justinian's throne. The message that had summoned him from his morning prayers was written in the urgent script reserved for matters touching the imperial security. Most excellent Logothete, a grave matter has occurred that requires your immediate attention. The body of Senator Maximus Planudes has been discovered in circumstances that suggest treachery against the emperor. The investigation must be conducted with absolute discretion. John understood the implications immediately. Senator Planudes had been one of the most vocal critics of the government's policies during the recent crisis, and his suspicious death could indicate either punishment for disloyalty or elimination by conspirators seeking to destabilize the regime further. In the volatile aftermath of the riots, any hint of continued plotting could reignite the violence that had nearly destroyed the city. Constantinople in 532 was the greatest city in the Christian world, the heir to both Rome and Athens, where East met West in a synthesis of imperial power, orthodox theology, and commercial prosperity. The city's 500,000 inhabitants included Greeks, Romans, Armenians, Syrians, and dozens of other peoples united under the purple banner of the Basileus. But this diversity also created tensions that could explode into violence when economic hardship met political discontent. John had risen from humble origins in Cappadocia to become one of Justinian's most trusted advisors through his brilliance in finance and administration. His tax policies had filled the imperial treasury and funded Justinian's ambitious building projects. But they had also earned him enemies among both the aristocracy and the common people who bore the burden of his efficient revenue collection. The Nika riots had begun as a dispute between the rival chariot racing factions, the Blues and Greens, but had quickly escalated into a general rebellion against the government. For 6 days, mobs had controlled much of the city, burning public buildings and demanding the dismissal of unpopular ministers like John himself. Only Empress Theodora's determination and Belisarius's military skill had prevented the complete collapse of Justinian's reign. Now, with the immediate crisis past, John faced the delicate task of investigating a murder that could either be connected to the recent unrest or represent a new threat to imperial stability. The investigation would require navigating the complex relationships between court factions, religious authorities, and the various interest groups that competed for influence in the Byzantine system. Senator Planudes had been found dead in his private study, apparently killed while reviewing documents related to his senatorial duties. The circumstances suggested assassination rather than robbery or personal violence. But the motives could range from political revenge to religious disputes to simple greed for his considerable wealth. John summoned his most trusted assistant, Stephanus the notary, an educated Syrian who had served the imperial administration for over 15 years. Stephanus combined administrative skill with discretion, making him valuable for sensitive investigations that required both political understanding and careful documentation. Stephanus, we must investigate this matter with extreme care. If Planudes was murdered for political reasons, we need to identify the perpetrators before they can strike again. If his death was connected to the recent riots, we must understand whether organized resistance to the government continues. Excellency, shall I arrange for the usual investigators to examine the scene? No, we will handle this personally. In matters touching imperial security, we cannot risk having sensitive information fall into the wrong hands or be used for political purposes by our enemies. The journey through Constantinople's streets revealed a city still recovering from the recent violence. Burned buildings stood as reminders of the riot's fury, while increased patrols of palace guards demonstrated the government's determination to maintain order. The Hippodrome, where thousands of rioters had been slaughtered by Belisarius's troops, remained closed as workers cleared away the evidence of the massacre. Senator Planudes had maintained his residence in the aristocratic district near the Forum of Constantine, in a substantial mansion that reflected both his ancient family status and his personal wealth accumulated through decades of successful political maneuvering. The building's architecture combined classical Roman elements with newer Christian symbols, representing the cultural synthesis that characterized Byzantine civilization. The senator's steward, an elderly Greek named Photius, met them at the entrance with the subdued manner of a household in mourning. As a freedman who had managed Planudes' domestic affairs for many years, Photius would have intimate knowledge of his master's activities and relationships. Most excellent logothete, this is a dark day for our household. The senator was a good master who served the empire faithfully. Photius, we must ask you some questions about your master's death. Please describe the circumstances in which his body was discovered. I found the senator in his private study early this morning when I came to wake him for his morning prayers. He was slumped over his writing desk, and there was blood on his robes. Did you notice anything else unusual about the scene? The senator's papers appeared to have been disturbed, and one of the windows to the garden was open, though it had been closed when I secured the house the previous evening. This suggested that the killer had entered through the garden rather than the main entrance, indicating someone with knowledge of the house's layout and security arrangements. Who else lives in the household? The senator's wife, the Lady Anastasia, their adult son, Theodorus, and several servants. There are also guards who patrol the grounds at night. Were any of the guards on duty when the senator was killed? 2 men were assigned to night watch, but they reported hearing nothing unusual. The study is located in the interior of the house, so sounds might not have carried to the outer courtyards. John examined the study carefully, noting details that might reveal the identity of the killer or the motive for the crime. The room was elegantly furnished with expensive furniture and decorated with mosaics depicting classical and Christian themes. Shelves lined the walls, filled with scrolls and codices, reflecting Planudes' interest in law, theology, and classical literature. The senator's body showed a single knife wound to the chest, inflicted with sufficient force to penetrate deeply. But there were no signs of struggle, suggesting either that Planudes had been taken by surprise or that he had known his attacker well enough to allow close approach. Stephanus, examine those papers on the desk. I want to know what the senator was working on when he died. The documents revealed that Planudes had been preparing a speech for the Senate regarding reconstruction efforts in the aftermath of the riots. But several pages appeared to be missing from what should have been a complete draft, and there were signs that someone had searched through the senator's private correspondence. Excellency, it appears the killer was looking for specific documents rather than simply eliminating the senator. This suggests knowledge of his activities and interest in particular information. What kind of information would be valuable enough to justify murder? Political intelligence, financial records, or evidence of corruption that could be used against prominent individuals. John's investigation was interrupted by the arrival of the senator's widow, Lady Anastasia, a woman of perhaps 45 with the dignified bearing and expensive clothing that marked her as a member of Constantinople's aristocratic elite. Most excellent logothete, I am grateful that you have taken personal interest in my husband's death. Maximus served the empire loyally and deserved better than to die at the hands of an assassin. Lady Anastasia, please accept my condolences for your loss. I must ask you some questions about your husband's recent activities and any threats he might have received. Maximus had been concerned about retaliation for his criticism of government policies during the recent crisis. He received several threatening messages from parties who blamed him for encouraging the riots. What kind of criticism had your husband expressed? He felt that excessive taxation and harsh administrative policies had contributed to the popular unrest. Maximus believed that reforms were necessary to prevent future rebellions. This could provide motive for murder if government supporters had decided that Planudes' continuing criticism threatened political stability. Did your husband mention any specific individuals who might have threatened him? He was particularly concerned about Praetorian prefect John the Armenian, who had accused him of disloyalty for questioning government policies. John the Armenian was indeed a powerful and ruthless official who had been instrumental in suppressing the riots. If he had viewed Planudes as a continuing threat to the regime, he would have both the motive and the means to arrange an assassination. Lady Anastasia, where were you on the night your husband was killed? In my chambers with my personal servants, as is proper for a Christian woman. We spent the evening in prayer and reading from the scriptures. Did you hear any sounds of disturbance from your husband's study? Nothing unusual. Maximus often worked late into the night, so I was accustomed to hearing him moving about in his private rooms. John's next interview was with the senator's son Theodorus, a young man of 25 who had been preparing to follow his father into imperial service. Theodorus had the education and bearing of the Byzantine aristocracy, but also the nervous energy of someone whose family's position had been threatened by recent events. Theodorus, your father's death is a great loss to both your family and the Senate. Did he discuss any concerns about his safety with you? My father was worried that his opposition to certain government policies had made him enemies among court officials. He felt that speaking truth to power was his duty as a senator, but he understood the risks. Did he mention any specific threats? There were anonymous messages warning him to moderate his criticism of the administration. But my father refused to be intimidated by such tactics. What was your father working on in his final days? He was preparing a comprehensive proposal for administrative reforms that would address the grievances that led to the recent riots. The work involved considerable research into financial policies and legal precedents. Theodorus, do you know if your father had discovered evidence of corruption or misconduct by government officials? The young man hesitated before answering. My father had mentioned finding irregularities in certain administrative accounts. He was considering whether to present this information to the emperor directly. This revelation added a new dimension to the investigation. If Planudes had uncovered evidence of corruption, it could provide motive for murder by the officials whose misconduct he threatened to expose. Where were you on the night your father was killed? At home, studying in my private chambers. I was preparing for examinations that would qualify me for administrative service. John's investigation of the household staff revealed additional information about the senator's final days. The servants reported increased activity in recent weeks, with more visitors than usual and longer working hours as Planudes prepared his reform proposals. Of particular interest was the account provided by Marcus, a young servant who helped maintain the garden where the killer had apparently gained entry. Excellence! I noticed that someone had been in the garden recently. Footprints in the flower beds and broken branches that suggested passage through the shrubbery. When did you first notice these signs? 2 days ago, but I thought they might have been made by one of the guards during their patrols. Did you report this to anyone? I mentioned it to the head gardener, but we decided it was not worth troubling the senator with such minor matters. This suggested that the killer had been conducting surveillance of the house before carrying out the assassination, indicating careful planning rather than a spontaneous crime. John decided to investigate the political implications of the murder by interviewing key government officials who might have viewed Planudes as a threat. His first meeting was with Praetorian Prefect John the Armenian, who controlled much of the empire's military and police apparatus. The prefect received him in his office in the palace complex, surrounded by maps of the empire and reports from commanders throughout the Byzantine territories. John the Armenian was a man of perhaps 50, with the hard expression and military bearing of someone who had risen through the ranks during decades of warfare. Logothete, I understand you are investigating Senator Planudes' unfortunate death. The loss of any senator is regrettable, even when their political judgment was questionable. Prefect, I am told that you had disagreements with the senator regarding government policies. Planudes was one of several senators who seemed to sympathize with the rioters' grievances rather than supporting the legitimate government. Such attitudes were dangerous during the recent crisis. Did you consider the senator disloyal to the emperor? I considered him misguided. Planudes failed to understand that criticism of government policies during a rebellion provides encouragement to the empire's enemies. Did you communicate these concerns to the senator directly? I may have suggested that his public statements were inappropriate given the circumstances, but I always conducted myself with proper respect for senatorial dignity. Prefect, where were you on the night Senator Planudes was killed? At the palace, meeting with military commanders about security arrangements for the post-riot period. Several officers can confirm my presence throughout the evening. While John the Armenian's alibi seems solid, his obvious hostility toward Planudes and his access to agents who could carry out assassinations made him a serious suspect. John's investigation also focused on Quaestor Tribonian, the chief legal officer responsible for Justinian's ambitious codification of Roman law. Tribonian was one of the most learned men in the empire, but also one of the most controversial due to his role in implementing legal reforms that affected established interests. Questor, Senator Planudes had been critical of certain administrative policies. Did his opposition create difficulties for your legal reforms? Planudes was concerned about the social impact of our legal and administrative changes. While I respected his dedication to the Senate's traditional role, I felt his concerns were sometimes exaggerated. Did you discuss these matters with the senator directly? We had several conversations about the relationship between legal reform and political stability. Planudes feared that rapid changes might provoke further unrest. What was your assessment of his concerns? I believe the senator was too conservative in his approach to necessary reforms, but I also recognized that his opposition represented legitimate senatorial prerogatives. Questor, did Senator Planudes ever accuse you or other officials of misconduct in implementing the legal reforms? He raised questions about certain procedures and financial arrangements, but nothing that constituted formal accusations of corruption. Where were you on the night the senator was killed? In my chambers, working on draft legislation for the emperor's review. My secretaries were present throughout the evening. Tribonian's account suggested that while he disagreed with Planudes politically, their relationship had remained within normal bounds of policy dispute rather than escalating to personal animosity. The investigation took a new direction when John discovered that Senator Planudes had been in contact with Patriarch Epiphanius, the head of the Constantinople Church, regarding religious aspects of the government's policies. The Patriarch received John in his residence adjacent to the Hagia Sophia, the magnificent church that Justinian was rebuilding as a symbol of his reign's glory. Epiphanius was a man of 60 with the ascetic appearance and scholarly manner of someone who had devoted his life to theological study and ecclesiastical administration. Most excellent logothete, Senator Planudes was a faithful Christian who was concerned about the spiritual implications of government policies. What kind of spiritual implications? The senator felt that excessive taxation and harsh enforcement methods were causing suffering that violated Christian principles of justice and mercy. Did he ask you to intercede with the emperor on these matters? Planudes suggested that the church should speak more forcefully about the government's moral obligations to the people, but I explained that direct political intervention would be inappropriate. Patriarch, did the senator mention any specific evidence of misconduct by government officials? He spoke in general terms about corruption and abuse of power, but provided no specific details that would justify ecclesiastical action. Did Senator Planudes have enemies within the church hierarchy? There were some clergy who felt his political activities were inappropriate for a devout Christian, but such disagreements rarely escalate beyond theological debate. The Patriarch's account suggested that while Planudes had sought religious support for his political positions, he had not uncovered specific evidence of corruption that would threaten particular individuals. John's investigation was complicated by the discovery that several documents were indeed missing from Planudes' study. A careful inventory revealed that financial records related to tax collection and expenditures for reconstruction projects had been removed, along with correspondence with other senators regarding political strategy. Stephanus, the killer, was specifically targeting documents that could expose financial irregularities or political coordination among the government's critics. Excellency, this suggests someone with detailed knowledge of the senator's work and strong motives for preventing its disclosure. But it also indicates that the murder was part of a broader cover-up rather than simple elimination of a political opponent. The breakthrough in the case came when John discovered that the missing financial documents had contained evidence of embezzlement in the reconstruction efforts following the riots. Several officials had been inflating costs and diverting funds intended for public works to their private accounts. Further investigation revealed that Senator Planudes had been preparing to present this evidence to Emperor Justinian, potentially exposing a corruption network that included prominent members of the administration. The trail led to Referendarius Peter Barsums, a senior financial official who had been responsible for coordinating reconstruction expenditures. Barsums had been stealing funds by creating fictitious contracts and inflating actual costs, generating substantial profits that he shared with co-conspirators. When confronted with the evidence, Barsums initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed to organizing the senator's murder to prevent exposure of the embezzlement scheme. Planudes had discovered irregularities in the reconstruction accounts and was tracing them back to their source, Barsums admitted. His investigation threatened to expose activities that involved substantial sums and several prominent officials. Who else was involved in this corruption network? Several clerks in the financial administration, along with contractors who submitted false invoices and shared the profits. The amounts involved were sufficient to compromise many careers if exposed. How was the senator's murder arranged? I hired a professional assassin, a former soldier who needed money and was willing to commit violence for adequate compensation. What was done with the stolen documents? They were destroyed immediately after the murder to eliminate evidence of the corruption network. The investigation revealed that the corruption scheme had diverted thousands of gold solidi intended for rebuilding Constantinople after the riots. The funds had been used to enrich the conspirators while leaving much of the damage unrepaired, contributing to continued popular resentment against the government. Senator Planudes had been killed not for his political opposition, but for his integrity in investigating financial misconduct that threatened to expose high-level corruption. The trials of the conspirators became a major scandal that rocked the Byzantine government. Barsums and his co-conspirators were executed for theft and murder, while their families were punished with confiscation of property and loss of status. The professional assassin, identified as a former soldier named Cosmas, was also executed after confessing to the actual killing. His testimony confirmed the details of the conspiracy and helped identify additional participants in the corruption network. Emperor Justinian used the scandal to strengthen his control over the administration by implementing new oversight procedures and replacing several senior officials whose loyalty was questionable. The investigation enhanced John the Cappadocian's reputation as an effective administrator, while also demonstrating the ongoing challenges of governing a complex empire. For the Byzantine system, the case highlighted the tensions between traditional senatorial independence and imperial administrative efficiency. Senator Planudes had died defending the Senate's role as a check on executive power, while his killers had exploited the administrative chaos following the riots to enrich themselves. The investigation established new precedents for investigating complex financial crimes and political conspiracies. John's methods combined traditional administrative inquiry with innovative techniques for tracing financial records and identifying networks of corrupt officials. The case also demonstrated the international implications of domestic Byzantine politics. The weakening of the government through corruption and internal conflict affected the empire's ability to defend its territories and maintain diplomatic relationships throughout the Mediterranean world. In his official report to Emperor Justinian, John wrote, "The murder of Senator Planudes was not merely a criminal act, but an attack on the principles of honest government and senatorial independence that support the stability of the empire." The investigation has revealed how corruption can threaten both individual lives and the broader welfare of the state. The case became part of the complex legacy of Justinian's reign, demonstrating both the achievements and the challenges of governing the last great Roman Empire. The exposure of the corruption network helped to restore public confidence in the government, but it also revealed the ongoing vulnerabilities that would continue to threaten Byzantine stability. John the Cappadocian continued to serve as logothete for several more years, implementing financial reforms that reduced opportunities for corruption while maintaining the revenue collection that funded Justinian's ambitious projects. But the Planudes case remained the most significant investigation of his career, a reminder of the constant vigilance required to protect honest government from those who would exploit public trust for private gain. The Purple Conspiracy, as historians would later call the case, illustrated the complex relationships between power, corruption, and justice in the Byzantine Empire. It showed how individual integrity could threaten established networks of corruption and how the pursuit of truth sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice. Senator Planudes was remembered as a martyr to governmental accountability, while his killers became symbols of the corruption, that could destroy even the greatest empires from within. The case served as a warning to future generations about the eternal struggle between public service and private greed that shapes the fate of nations. In the magnificent city of Constantinople, where the domes of new churches rose beside the columns of ancient temples, the memory of Senator Planutus's sacrifice continued to inspire those who believed that honest government was worth defending with one's life. The purple of imperial power had been stained with the blood of corruption, but justice had ultimately prevailed through the dedication of those who refused to let crime hide behind official authority. Let's head into year 1849 with story number 2. The California Gold, Sacramento, California, August 1849. Sheriff Thomas Bennett adjusted his hat against the scorching August sun as he rode through the dusty streets of Sacramento toward the riverfront district where the latest trouble had erupted. At 41, he had been keeping the peace in California's rapidly growing capital for 3 years, since before the gold rush transformed the sleepy settlement into a chaotic boomtown of nearly 10,000 souls from every corner of the world. The message that had summoned him from his morning rounds was brief but urgent. "Sheriff, we got ourselves a real problem down at Sutter's warehouse. Dead body, and it ain't no accident. Looks like someone's been playing for higher stakes than gold panning." It was signed by Deputy Marshal Williams, one of the few reliable lawmen in a territory where federal authority was still being established, and local justice often came at the end of a rope. Sacramento in August 1849 was a city transformed by gold fever. What had been Captain John Sutter's agricultural outpost just 2 years earlier was now a sprawling maze of tents, wooden shacks, and hastily constructed buildings housing miners, merchants, gamblers, and fortune seekers from around the globe. The American River ran yellow with sediment from thousands of mining claims upstream, while the Sacramento River brought a constant stream of steamboats loaded with supplies and new arrivals chasing dreams of easy wealth. Bennett had come to California in 1846 as part of the Bear Flag Republic, fought in the Mexican-American War, and stayed to help establish American law in the newly acquired territory. His experience as a Texas Ranger had prepared him for frontier violence, but nothing had quite prepared him for the unique challenges of a gold rush boomtown where men carried fortunes in gold dust, and murder could be motivated by anything from claim jumping to card cheating to simple greed. The warehouse district along the Sacramento River was the commercial heart of the city, where merchants stored goods destined for the mining camps, and where successful miners came to convert their gold into supplies, luxury items, or passage back to civilization. The buildings were substantial structures by frontier standards, built to withstand both floods and the occasional fire that swept through the wooden city. Sutter's warehouse was one of the largest, a 2-story frame building that stored everything from mining equipment to fine wines imported from San Francisco. Captain John Sutter himself had become one of California's most prominent citizens, though the gold rush had brought him more problems than profits, as squatters overran his land and miners stripped his property without compensation. Deputy Marshal Williams met Bennett at the warehouse entrance, his face grim with the expression of a man who had seen something that didn't sit right. "Sheriff, we got ourselves a puzzle here. The victim is Heinrich Mueller, one of them German miners who struck it rich up in the American River diggings. Found him this morning with a bullet in his chest and his gold nowhere to be found." "How much gold are we talking about, Williams?" Word was Mueller had been bragging about pulling $20,000 worth of dust and nuggets out of his claim over the past 6 months. That's enough to kill for, even in a place where men carry guns as casual as pocket watches. $20,000 was indeed a fortune, more than most men could earn in a lifetime of ordinary work. In the gold rush economy, such wealth could make a man either very powerful or very dead, depending on how carefully he handled his good fortune. "Any witnesses to the shooting?" "That's where it gets interesting, Sheriff. The warehouse was supposed to be locked up tight last night, but someone had a key or knew how to pick the lock. Mueller was found inside, like he was meeting someone he trusted." "What was Mueller doing at the warehouse?" "According to the clerk, Mueller had been storing his gold here in one of Sutter's strong boxes, safer than keeping it in his tent up at the diggings, what with all the claim jumpers and road agents working the mining camps." This suggested that Mueller's killer had known about his storage arrangements and had lured him to the warehouse for what the victim thought was a legitimate business meeting. Bennett examined the scene carefully. Muller's body lay near a large iron strongbox that had been opened and emptied, its contents scattered across the wooden floor. The German miner had been a big man, probably in his 40s, with the weathered hands and sun-darkened skin of someone who had spent months working placer claims along the river. The single gunshot wound was to the chest, fired from close range with what appeared to be a large caliber pistol. But there were no signs of struggle, suggesting that Muller had been taken by surprise or had trusted his killer enough to allow close approach. Williams, what do we know about Muller's associates and business relationships? He was a loner mostly, but he'd been seen around town with a few different folks. There's Samuel Brannan, the merchant who's been buying gold from miners and selling them supplies. There's also Captain Weber, who runs freight operations between Sacramento and San Francisco. And there's that gambler, Louis Cora, who's been running high-stakes poker games for miners with serious money. Each of these men would have had both the opportunity to learn about Muller's wealth and the means to arrange his murder. But proving guilt would require understanding the specific circumstances that had brought Muller to the warehouse on his final night. Any idea what time the murder took place? Based on the body's condition and the fact that the night watchman heard what might have been a gunshot around midnight, I'd say Muller died sometime between 11 and 1 o'clock. What about this night watchman? Did he see anything? Old Pete Kowalski makes rounds of the warehouse district every couple of hours. He says he heard what sounded like a gunshot around midnight, but didn't investigate because gunshots ain't exactly unusual in Sacramento on a Saturday night. This was unfortunately true. The combination of alcohol, gambling, and men carrying both gold and weapons made weekend violence a regular occurrence in the boomtown. Bennett's investigation began with Muller's recent activities and relationships. The German miner had been living in a tent camp near the American River diggings, about 15 miles east of Sacramento, but had been making regular trips to town to bank his gold and purchase supplies. The tent camp was a typical mining settlement, a collection of canvas shelters, crude wooden shacks, and mining equipment scattered along the riverbank where placer deposits had proved profitable. The miners were a diverse group: Americans from the eastern states, Mexicans who had been working California goldfields for decades, Chinese immigrants seeking better opportunities, and Europeans like Muller who had traveled halfway around the world chasing rumors of easy wealth. Johann Weber, a fellow German who had been Muller's neighbor at the diggings, provided insights into the victim's recent concerns and activities. Heinrich was worried about keeping his gold safe, Weber explained in heavily accented English. He had been very successful, but success makes a man targets for robbers and claim jumpers. Did Muller trust anyone in particular with information about his mining success? He was careful about who he talked to, but he mentioned doing business with that merchant Brannan and with the freight captain who ships goods to San Francisco. What about enemies? Did Muller have disputes with other miners or businessmen? There was trouble with some Mexican miners who claimed Heinrich's diggings were on land that had belonged to their families before the Americans came. But Heinrich had legal papers from the territorial government. This land dispute added another potential motive for murder. The Mexican-American War had ended just the year before, and many Californios, Mexican citizens who had lived in California before the American conquest, found their property rights challenged by the flood of American settlers and miners. Did these Mexican miners make specific threats against Muller? There were angry words, and one of them, a man named Carlos Herrera, said Heinrich would regret stealing Mexican gold. But I don't know if he meant violence or just legal troubles. Bennett made note of Herrera as a potential suspect who would need to be investigated. Land disputes in Gold Rush, California often escalated to violence when legal remedies seemed inadequate or unavailable. His next interview was with Samuel Brannan, the merchant who had become one of California's wealthiest men by selling supplies to miners at inflated prices while also buying their gold at discount rates. Brannan's store in Sacramento was one of the territory's most successful businesses, and his political connections made him influential in territorial affairs. Brannan was a man of 30 with a confident manner and expensive clothes that marked him as one of Sacramento's emerging elite. His store was well stocked with goods that commanded premium prices in the goldfields: tools, clothing, food, and luxury items that miners purchased when they struck it rich. Sheriff Bennett, Heinrich Muller's death is a great loss to our community. He was one of our most successful miners and a reliable customer. Mr. Brannon, I understand you did regular business with Muller. What was the nature of your relationship? Heinrich brought his gold to me for conversion to currency and credit arrangements. I also supplied him with mining equipment and provisions for his work at the diggings. How much gold had Muller brought you recently? Over the past several months, probably $15,000 worth of dust and nuggets. Heinrich was one of the most successful placer miners working the American River. Did you know about his storage arrangements at Sutter's warehouse? I recommended that he use Sutter's strongbox services for security. Keeping large amounts of gold in the mining camps is dangerous due to theft and robbery. Mr. Brannon, did Muller seem worried about anything recently? Any threats or disputes you were aware of? Heinrich mentioned some trouble with Mexican miners who disputed his claim boundaries. He was also concerned about road agents who had been robbing miners traveling between the diggings and Sacramento. Where were you on Saturday night when Muller was killed? At home with my family. We had dinner together and spent the evening reading. My wife and children can confirm my presence. Brannon's alibi seems solid, but Bennett noted that as one of the few people who knew the exact extent of Muller's wealth, the merchant would have had both motive and opportunity to arrange the murder through agents or accomplices. Captain James Weber ran freight operations between Sacramento and San Francisco, transporting both goods and passengers along the rivers and overland routes that connected California's boomtowns. His business required detailed knowledge of who was shipping what cargo, making him privy to information about miners' wealth and movements. Weber was a man of perhaps 45, with the practical manner of someone accustomed to organizing complex transportation operations in challenging terrain. His office near the riverfront was filled with maps, shipping schedules, and correspondence with clients throughout the territory. Captain Weber, I understand Heinrich Muller used your freight services to ship gold to San Francisco banks. Heinrich was one of several miners who trusted me to transport their gold safely to the banking houses in San Francisco. It's safer than carrying large amounts of wealth overland or keeping it in the mining camps. How much gold had you transported for Muller? Over the past few months, probably $8,000 worth. Heinrich was conservative about shipping. He preferred to accumulate substantial amounts before making shipments to reduce transportation costs. Did you know about Muller's storage arrangements in Sacramento? I knew he was banking some of his gold locally, but I didn't know the specific details of his arrangements with Sutter's warehouse. Captain, did Muller mention any concerns about threats or disputes? He was worried about the Mexican miners who claimed his diggings were on disputed land. Heinrich felt they might try to drive him off through intimidation or violence. Where were you on Saturday night? At the hotel, meeting with other freight operators about coordinating shipments to the mining camps. Several people can confirm my presence throughout the evening. Like Brannon, Weber had a credible alibi, but also detailed knowledge of Muller's business activities that could have been used to plan the murder. The most intriguing suspect was Louis Cora, a professional gambler who had arrived in Sacramento earlier that year and quickly established himself as the operator of the city's most exclusive poker games. Cora catered to successful miners and wealthy merchants who could afford to gamble with thousands of dollars at stake. Cora was a man of perhaps 35, with a smooth manner and expensive clothes of a professional card sharp. His gambling establishment occupied the second floor of a hotel near the riverfront, where miners with successful claims could play for stakes that would be impossible in most other parts of the country. Mr. Cora, I understand Heinrich Muller was a regular player in your poker games. Heinrich enjoyed cards and was skilled enough to win more often than he lost. He was always welcome at my tables. How much money did Muller typically gamble with? Heinrich usually played with several $100s in gold dust or nuggets. He was conservative for a miner, never risked more than he could afford to lose. Did he have any disputes with other players or debts from gambling losses? Heinrich was an honorable player who paid his debts promptly and never caused trouble at the tables. But high-stakes gambling can create tensions between players. What kind of tensions? Some players suspected Heinrich of being luckier than skill alone would justify. There were whispers about whether he might be cheating, though I never observed any improper behavior. Accusations of cheating at cards could indeed provide motive for murder in a frontier environment where such disputes were often settled with violence. Mr. Cora, were you aware of the extent of Mueller's mining success? Heinrich was discreet about his wealth, but anyone who observed his gambling habits and expenditures could estimate that he was doing quite well at his diggings. Where were you on Saturday night when Mueller was killed? Running my poker game as usual. We had players until nearly dawn, and several people can confirm my presence throughout the night. The gambler's alibi seems solid, but Bennett noted that Cora's establishment would have been a perfect place to gather intelligence about miners' wealth and to identify potential targets for robbery or murder. The investigation took a new direction when Bennett learned that Mueller had been planning to return to Germany with his accumulated wealth. The German miner had booked passage on a steamship scheduled to depart San Francisco for Panama in early September, with connections to Hamburg. This information came from Heinrich Schultz, a German merchant who served as an informal banker and travel agent for German immigrants in California. Heinrich Mueller was homesick and wanted to return to his family in Bavaria, Schultz explained. He had saved enough money to buy land and establish himself as a prosperous farmer in the old country. When did Mueller make these travel arrangements? Just last week. He was very excited about going home with enough wealth to make himself independent for life. Did Mueller discuss his travel plans with anyone else? He was discreet, but word spreads quickly in the German community. Several people knew he was planning to leave California soon. This provided a potential timeline that could have motivated the murder. If someone had learned that Mueller was planning to leave with his accumulated wealth, they might have decided to act quickly before the opportunity was lost. Bennett's investigation of the Mexican miners who had disputed Mueller's claim led him to Carlos Herrera, a Californian whose family had owned a large ranch in the area before the American conquest. Herrera and his sons had been working placer claims along the American River, but with limited success compared to more recent arrivals like Mueller. Herrera was a man of 50 with the proud bearing of the old California landed aristocracy and the bitter expression of someone who had seen his world transformed by forces beyond his control. Sheriff, I had no love for the German, but I did not kill him. Carlos, I understand you believed Mueller's mining claim was on land that had belonged to your family. My family owned thousands of acres along the American River under the Mexican government. But the Americans say our old grants are not valid, and they give our land to anyone who files the proper papers. Did you threaten Mueller specifically? I told him he was working Mexican land without permission. But threatening and killing are different things. Where were you on Saturday night when Mueller was murdered? At home with my family, as any Christian man should be on Saturday night. My wife and sons can confirm this. Carlos, do you know of anyone else who might have wanted to harm Mueller? The German had enemies among both Mexican and American miners. His success made others jealous, and his methods were sometimes aggressive in protecting his claims. This suggested that Mueller might have had additional enemies that Bennett had not yet identified. The breakthrough in the case came when Bennett discovered that Mueller had been carrying a large amount of gold dust with him on the night he was killed. Gold that was not found at the murder scene, but that several witnesses had seen him with earlier that evening. Williams. Mueller was planning to make a major deposit at Sutter's warehouse, but the gold he was carrying disappeared with his killer. How much gold are we talking about, Sheriff? According to the German merchant Schultz, Mueller had cleaned out his tent camp and was bringing his final accumulation of gold to Sacramento for safekeeping before his departure for Germany. That could be several $1,000s worth. Exactly, and it means the killer was someone who knew about Mueller's plans and specifically targeted him for that gold. Further investigation revealed that Mueller had been seen that evening at Brannan's store, making final purchases for his trip home, and had mentioned to several people that he was carrying his remaining gold to put in Sutter's strongbox. The critical clue came from an unexpected source, a Chinese miner named Li Wei, who worked claims downstream from Mueller's diggings, and who had been in Sacramento on business the night of the murder. I saw the German man talking with the Mexican, Herrera, near the warehouse district, Li Wei told Bennett through a translator. They seemed to be arguing about something, and Herrera looked very angry. What time was this? Late in the evening, maybe an hour before midnight. Did you see what happened next? I had my own business to attend to, but I heard a gunshot from that direction not long after. This testimony placed Herrera at the scene around the time of the murder, contradicting his alibi of being home with a family. When confronted with this evidence, Herrera initially maintained his innocence, but eventually broke down and confessed to the killing. "I did not plan to kill him," Herrera admitted. "I went to the warehouse to confront Mueller about the land he had stolen from my family. But when I saw all that gold he was carrying, I, I lost my head. How did you get Mueller to meet you at the warehouse?" "I told him I had information about other miners who were planning to jump his claim. He agreed to meet me there to discuss protection for his diggings." "What happened during the confrontation?" "I demanded that Mueller pay my family compensation for using our land. He refused and said the Americans would never recognize Mexican land rights. When he turned to leave, I shot him." "What did you do with his gold?" "I buried it in the hills above Sacramento. I was afraid to spend it because I knew it would connect me to the murder." The confession solved the immediate mystery of Mueller's death, but it also revealed the broader tensions that were shaping Gold Rush California. The murder was not simply a crime of greed, but a violent collision between different concepts of land ownership and justice. Herrera's trial became a sensation in Sacramento, highlighting the complex legal and cultural issues facing the territory as it transitioned from Mexican to American rule. The defense argued that Herrera had been driven to violence by the injustice of losing ancestral lands to American miners who had no connection to the region. The prosecution countered that murder could never be justified regardless of political grievances, and that allowing such violence would undermine the rule of law necessary for territorial development. The jury, composed entirely of American settlers, convicted Herrera of murder and sentenced him to death. But the case sparked ongoing debates about land rights, cultural conflict, and the treatment of Mexican citizens under American rule. The recovered gold was returned to Mueller's family in Germany, along with his accumulated savings from Sutter's warehouse. The German miner's dream of returning home wealthy had been cut short by violence, but his family was at least able to benefit from his success. Captain Sutter implemented improved security measures at his warehouse, while other merchants and miners became more cautious about discussing their wealth openly. The murder served as a reminder that gold rush prosperity always came with significant risks. Sheriff Bennett's investigation established his reputation as an effective lawman, capable of solving complex crimes involving cultural and political tensions. His methods combined traditional frontier law enforcement with careful attention to evidence and witness testimony. The case also highlighted the challenges facing law enforcement in a rapidly changing territory where multiple legal systems, languages, and cultural traditions intersected. Bennett's success in solving the murder helped establish precedents for handling similar cases in the future. For the broader California gold rush, Mueller's murder represented the dark side of the wealth and opportunity that drew hundreds of thousands of people to the territory. The easy riches promised by gold mining came with dangers that extended far beyond the physical hazards of placer mining and hydraulic operations. The case became part of the folklore of the gold rush, a reminder that the pursuit of wealth could corrupt moral judgment and lead to tragic consequences for both perpetrators and victims. It illustrated how individual crimes could reflect broader social conflicts and historical transformations. In his official report, Bennett wrote, "The murder of Heinrich Mueller demonstrates that the gold rush has created unprecedented opportunities for both prosperity and violence. As California transitions from frontier territory to organized state, we must develop legal institutions capable of protecting law-abiding citizens while addressing the legitimate grievances of all communities." The California gold rush continued to transform the region, eventually bringing statehood and more stable institutions. But the tensions between different ethnic communities, competing land claims, and individual ambition versus collective welfare would remain challenging issues for decades to come. Heinrich Mueller's grave in the Sacramento cemetery became a symbol of both the dreams and dangers of the gold rush era. His story served as a cautionary tale about the price of success in a land where fortunes could be made or lost in an instant, and where the pursuit of gold could lead men to both great achievement and terrible violence. The investigation had revealed that even in the lawless atmosphere of a frontier boomtown, careful detective work could uncover the truth and bring killers to justice. But it had also shown that true justice required addressing the broader social and political conflicts that created conditions for such violence to occur. In story number 3, we find ourselves in year 975 AD, the Blood Eagle's shadow. Bergen, Kingdom of Norway, October 975 AD. Jarl Magnus Eriksson stood on the wooden ramparts of his hall, watching the autumn mist rise from the fjord as his longships returned from their final trading voyage of the season. At 42, he was one of the most powerful jarls in western Norway, commanding the loyalty of over 300 warriors and controlling trade routes that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. But the message that had arrived with the dawn brought news that threatened to shatter the carefully maintained peace of his domain. The rune-carved wooden tablet bore grim tidings. Jarl Magnus, the merchant Olaf Thorson, has been found dead at his trading post. The manner of his death suggests the Blood Eagle, the sacred execution reserved for oathbreakers and enemies of the gods. If this is murder rather than divine justice, it threatens the stability of our entire trading confederation. The Blood Eagle was the most feared of all Norse punishments, a ritual execution where the victim's ribs were cut from the spine and pulled apart like wings, while the lungs were pulled out to resemble an eagle's plumage. Such a death was reserved for the worst traitors and blasphemers, those who had violated the most sacred oaths and brought dishonor upon their clans and gods. Magnus had ruled his domain for 15 years, since inheriting his father's position and expanding it through successful raids, profitable trading ventures, and careful political alliances. His hall at Bergen served as both fortress and commercial center, where merchants from across the known world came to trade furs, amber, and walrus ivory for silver, silk, and precious weapons. The Norse society of 975 was entering a period of transformation as traditional pagan beliefs encountered Christian influences spreading from the south and east. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark had recently converted to Christianity, while raids on Christian lands continued to bring both wealth and religious tensions back to Scandinavia. This collision of old and new ways created opportunities for prosperity, but also sources of deadly conflict. Magnus summoned his most trusted advisor, Ragnar the Law Speaker, an elderly man whose knowledge of Norse law, genealogy, and custom made him invaluable in resolving disputes and maintaining order. As law speaker, Ragnar was responsible for memorizing and reciting the complex oral traditions that governed everything from property rights to blood feuds. Ragnar, if Olaf Thorson truly died by the Blood Eagle, we must determine whether this was lawful execution or murder disguised as justice. Jarl Magnus, the Blood Eagle is sacred to Odin, reserved for those who have committed the gravest crimes against God and community. If someone has profaned this ritual for personal vengeance, it is an offense that demands blood payment. What could Olaf have done to deserve such a death? The merchant was wealthy and ambitious, with trading connections throughout the northern lands. But I know of no crimes that would justify the Blood Eagle. His death may be connected to the commercial disputes that have been growing among our trading partners. This was concerning. The trading confederation that Magnus led was held together by carefully negotiated agreements about routes, prices, and territorial boundaries. If commercial competition had escalated to ritual murder, it could destroy the economic foundation of his power. Magnus assembled a small party to investigate the crime scene, including Ragnar, his champion Bjorn Ironside, and his skald Eric the Far-Traveled, whose knowledge of distant lands and peoples made him useful in understanding foreign customs and motivations that might be relevant to the case. The journey to Olaf's trading post took them up the fjord by longship, through landscapes that embodied the stark beauty of Norse territories. Steep mountains rose from dark waters, while farms and fishing villages occupied the narrow strips of arable land along the shoreline. The forests were ablaze with autumn colors, and the first snows of winter dusted the highest peaks. Olaf's trading post was located at a strategic point where two fjords met, allowing control of trade routes leading inland towards Sweden and Denmark. The settlement included a substantial wooden hall, warehouses for storing goods, workshops for local craftsmen, and quarters for the permanent residents who maintained the post year-round. The body had been discovered by Olaf's wife, Astrid, when she came to wake him for morning prayers to the gods. The scene was horrific even by Viking standards. Olaf had indeed died by the Blood Eagle, his ribs cut and spread, his lungs pulled out in the ritual manner. But something about the execution seemed wrong to Magnus's experienced eye. Ragnar, examine the positioning and the cuts. Does this seem like proper ritual work to you? The old law speaker studied the corpse carefully, noting details that would help determine whether the execution had been performed correctly according to traditional requirements. The cuts are rough and uneven, Jarl Magnus. Whoever did this work was either inexperienced in the ritual or was working hastily under difficult conditions. What does that suggest about the killer? Either this was performed by someone unfamiliar with the proper procedures, or it was done by someone who wanted to make it appear like a ritual execution while actually committing murder for other motives. This was a crucial distinction. If the blood eagle had been performed improperly, it suggested murder rather than legitimate execution, which would require a completely different investigation focused on personal motives rather than questions of justice and religious law. Magnus interviewed Astrid Olafsdottir, the victim's wife, a woman of perhaps 35 with the strong bearing typical of Norse women who managed household affairs and could fight alongside their men when necessary. Astrid, your husband's death is a great loss to our community. Did Olaf have enemies who might have wanted him dead? Olaf was successful in trade, which always creates jealousy among competitors. But I know of no specific threats that would justify the Blood Eagle. Had your husband been involved in any disputes about trading rights or commercial agreements? There had been tensions with some of the Danish merchants who wanted access to our northern routes. Olaf refused to share certain trade secrets that had been passed down in his family for generations. What kind of trade secrets? Knowledge of the best hunting grounds for walrus and seals, relationships with Greenland settlers who provided valuable ivory, and safe routes through the ice fields that other traders could not navigate. Such information was indeed valuable enough to motivate violence, especially in a society where commercial success often depended on closely guarded knowledge passed down through family lines. Astrid, did your husband practice the old religion, or was he interested in the new Christian faith? Olaf honored both the old gods and the white Christ, as many traders do. He felt it was wise to seek protection from all sources when traveling to dangerous foreign lands. This religious flexibility was common among Norse merchants who dealt with Christian territories, but it could also create enemies among those who viewed such accommodation as betrayal of traditional beliefs. Did anyone visit your husband on the night he was killed? Several people came to discuss business matters. There was Gunnar the shipwright, who wanted to arrange for timber exports. There was also a foreign merchant, a Saxon named Aldrich, who claimed to represent English buyers. And there was Thorstein the Stout, who has been competing with Olaf for access to the Greenland trade. Each of these visitors would need to be investigated as potential suspects with different motives for wanting Olaf dead. Magnus's investigation began with Gunnar the shipwright, a craftsman whose skills in building and repairing longships made him valuable to the entire trading community. Gunnar's workshop was located near the shoreline, where he had access to both timber and the ships that required his services. Gunnar was a man of perhaps 50, with the powerful build and careful hands of a master craftsman. His workshop was filled with the tools and materials needed to construct the sophisticated vessels that made Norse expansion possible. Gunnar, I understand you visited Olaf Thorson on the night he was killed. Yes, Jarl Magnus, we were discussing arrangements for a timber shipment to England. Olaf had connections with English buyers, who paid good prices for quality Norwegian wood. Did your negotiations with Olaf go smoothly? There were some disagreements about prices and delivery schedules. Olaf was demanding terms that would have left me with very small profits for considerable work. Did these disagreements become heated? We argued, but nothing unusual for business negotiations. I've known Olaf for many years, and we always managed to reach agreements eventually. Gunnar, did you know that Olaf was dealing with Saxon merchants independently of your timber arrangements? I suspected he had other English connections, but Olaf was secretive about some of his business relationships. Where were you after leaving Olaf's hall? I returned to my workshop to finish repairs on a trading ship that needs to be ready before winter. My apprentices were working with me through the night. Gunnar's alibi seemed credible, but Magnus noted that the shipwright had detailed knowledge of Olaf's business activities and could have harbored resentment about unfavorable trading terms. The Saxon merchant Aldrich proved more difficult to locate, as he was staying at various locations around the fjord while conducting his business. Magnus eventually found him at a smaller trading post, examining furs and amber for potential purchase. Aldrich was a man of 40 with the well-traveled appearance of someone who spent his life moving between different markets and cultures. He spoke Norse with a heavy accent, but demonstrated familiarity with local customs and trading practices. Aldrich, I understand you met with Olaf Thorson recently to discuss business matters. Yes, my lord. I represent English buyers who are interested in Nordic goods. Furs, amber, walrus ivory. Olaf had access to some of the finest products from the Northern Territories. What was the nature of your negotiations with Olaf? We were discussing exclusive arrangements that would give my English buyers priority access to certain goods in exchange for guaranteed purchases and premium prices. Did Olaf agree to these arrangements? He was considering them, but he wanted time to consult with his other trading partners before making commitments. Were there any disputes or disagreements during your meeting? Olaf was concerned about maintaining his relationships with existing customers. He didn't want to anger Danish or Swedish merchants by giving English buyers preferential treatment. Aldrich, are you familiar with Norse religious customs and ritual practices? The Saxon's expression became guarded. I know something about your customs, but I am a Christian and do not participate in pagan rituals. Have you ever witnessed or heard descriptions of the Blood Eagle execution? I have heard stories, but such practices are disturbing to Christian sensibilities. Where were you on the night Olaf was killed? At my lodgings, reviewing accounts and preparing letters to my partners in England. The household where I'm staying can confirm my presence. Aldrich's unfamiliarity with Norse ritual practices made it unlikely that he could have performed the Blood Eagle correctly, but his foreign status also made him a potential scapegoat if local suspects proved difficult to identify. Thorstein the Stout was perhaps the most promising suspect, as his competition with Olaf for access to Greenland trade routes provided clear economic motives for murder. Magnus found him at his own trading post, a smaller operation that specialized in Arctic products. Thorstein was a large man in his 40s, with the weathered appearance of someone who regularly sailed the dangerous northern routes to Greenland and beyond. His haul was filled with walrus ivory, sealskins, and other products that commanded high prices in southern markets. Thorstein, the entire trading community has been shaken by Olaf's death. Did you know him well? Olaf and I had been competitors for many years, but we maintained proper relationships. Competition is natural in trade. I understand you were seeking access to some of Olaf's Greenland trading connections. The northern routes are profitable but dangerous. Olaf had developed relationships with Greenland settlers that I hoped to share or purchase. Did he agree to share this access? Olaf was protective of his trading secrets. He felt that sharing route information would reduce his own profits and competitive advantages. Did this create tension between you? We had disagreements, but nothing that justified violence. I understood his position even if I didn't like it. Thorstein, are you familiar with the ritual of the Blood Eagle? Every Norse warrior knows of it, though few have witnessed such executions. It is reserved for the worst traitors and oathbreakers. Have you ever performed or assisted in such a ritual? No, and I would not want to unless it was clearly justified by the victim's crimes. Where were you on the night Olaf was killed? At home with my family, reviewing charts and planning the next season's trading voyages. My wife and children can confirm my presence. Despite his denials, Thorstein had both motive and opportunity to kill Olaf, along with the knowledge necessary to attempt the Blood Eagle ritual. Magnus's investigation took an unexpected turn when he discovered that Olaf had been secretly converting some of his wealth to Christian religious objects, crosses, reliquaries, and illuminated manuscripts, rather than traditional Norse treasure. This information came from Brother Benedict, an Irish monk who served as a missionary in the region and who had been teaching some of the local merchants about Christian theology and practices. Brother Benedict, I understand Olaf Thorson had been interested in Christian teachings. Olaf was curious about the Christian faith and had begun attending some of my services. He was particularly interested in Christian concepts of salvation and eternal life. Did he make any formal conversion to Christianity? He had not yet taken baptism, but he was seriously considering embracing the faith. Olaf felt that Christianity offered spiritual benefits that complemented his existing beliefs. Did anyone in the community know about Olaf's religious interests? He was discreet about his inquiries, but religious conversion is difficult to hide completely. Some of his traditional associates may have suspected his changing beliefs. Brother Benedict, would Olaf's interest in Christianity be seen as betrayal by those who follow the old religion? Unfortunately, yes. There are those who view any accommodation with Christianity as abandonment of Norse heritage and dishonor to the ancient gods. This provided a potential religious motive for the murder. If Olaf had been killed for religious apostasy, the blood eagle would indeed be an appropriate punishment according to traditional Norse law and custom. Further investigation revealed that Olaf had been planning to establish a Christian chapel at his trading post, using some of his accumulated wealth to support missionary activities in the region. Such a plan would have been seen as a direct challenge to traditional religious authorities. The breakthrough in the case came when Magnus discovered that the blood eagle had been performed incorrectly, not due to inexperience, but because the killer had been interrupted before completing the ritual properly. Tracks in the mud around Olaf's hall showed that someone had approached and then left hastily, suggesting that the murderer had been surprised during the execution and forced to flee before finishing the work properly. Ragnar, someone interrupted the killer while he was performing the blood eagle. That's why the cuts were hasty and uneven. Who would have been likely to interrupt such a ritual, Jarl Magnus? Someone who had legitimate business with Olaf, or someone whose arrival was unexpected. This led Magnus to re-examine the accounts provided by Olaf's visitors on the night of the murder. One inconsistency stood out. Thorstein claimed to have left Olaf's hall early in the evening, but other witnesses placed him in the area much later. When confronted with this contradiction, Thorstein initially maintained his story, but eventually broke down and confessed to the killing. "I did not intend to kill him at first," Thorstein admitted. "I returned to Olaf's hall late in the evening to make one final offer for access to his Greenland roots." What happened during this second meeting? Olaf told me he was planning to abandon the northern trade entirely and focus on supporting Christian missionaries. He said the old ways of making wealth through raiding and dangerous voyages were no longer necessary. How did you respond to this news? I was furious. Olaf was abandoning everything that made us strong as a people. His wealth came from following the old ways, and now he wanted to betray those traditions for foreign superstitions. So you decided to execute him for apostasy? I felt the blood eagle was justified punishment for betraying our gods and our people. But I was interrupted by his wife returning to the hall unexpectedly. What did you do then? I fled through the back of the hall before I could complete the ritual properly. I hoped it would still send a message to others who might consider abandoning our traditional ways. The confession solved the immediate mystery of Olaf's death, but it also revealed the deeper religious and cultural tensions that were affecting Norse society as Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia. Thorstein's trial was conducted according to traditional Norse law, with Magnus serving as judge and a jury of prominent local men deciding guilt and punishment. The case highlighted the complex legal issues surrounding religious conversion and cultural change. The prosecution argued that while apostasy might traditionally justify severe punishment, Olaf had not formally converted to Christianity and had continued to honor the old gods alongside his interest in the new faith. The defense countered that Olaf's plans to support Christian missionaries constituted active betrayal of Norse religious traditions, and that Thorstein had acted to protect the spiritual welfare of the community. The jury ultimately convicted Thorstein of murder, finding that his religious justifications did not excuse the improper performance of the blood eagle ritual and his failure to seek community approval for such an extreme punishment. However, in recognition of his sincere religious motivations and his status as a respected member of the trading community, Thorstein was sentenced to exile rather than death. He was required to leave Norway and forbidden to return for 7 years. The case established important precedents for handling religious conflicts in an era of cultural transition. It demonstrated that while traditional Norse law recognized religious crimes, accusations of apostasy required proper legal procedures rather than individual vigilante justice. For the broader Norse community, Olaf's murder represented the tensions between traditional paganism and incoming Christian influences. The case showed how religious conversion could be seen as both personal salvation and cultural betrayal. Magnus used the investigation to strengthen his authority as a judge capable of handling complex legal and cultural disputes. His fair treatment of both traditional and Christian elements in the case helped maintain stability during a period of religious transition. The trading confederations survived the crisis, though new agreements were established to prevent future conflicts over religious differences among member merchants. The case demonstrated that commercial success required accommodation of different beliefs rather than enforcement of religious uniformity. Brother Benedict continued his missionary work, but with greater awareness of the sensitivities involved in religious conversion. The murder served as a reminder that spiritual change required careful handling to avoid violence and community division. Olaf's widow Astrid inherited his trading operations and proved to be a capable merchant in her own right. She maintained relationships with both Christian and pagan traders, demonstrating that commercial success could transcend religious boundaries. The case became part of the oral traditions preserved by skalds and law speakers, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of proper legal procedures in resolving community conflicts. In his judgment, Magnus declared, "The blood eagle is sacred to our people, but it must not be profaned by private vengeance or religious hatred. Justice requires that such extreme punishments be applied only with proper authority and clear justification." The investigation had shown that even in the warrior culture of the Norse, careful attention to evidence and legal procedure could resolve complex cases involving religious, commercial, and personal motives. Years later, when Christianity had become more established throughout Scandinavia, the case was remembered as an example of how legal institutions could adapt to cultural change while maintaining social order and protecting individual rights. The Blood Eagle's shadow had fallen across the trading community, but justice had ultimately prevailed through careful investigation and fair legal procedures. The case demonstrated that even the most traditional societies could evolve their institutions to meet new challenges while preserving essential values of law and community welfare. Magnus continued to rule his domain for many more years, overseeing the gradual transition from purely pagan to mixed Christian-pagan society. The Olaf Thorson case remained the most complex investigation of his career, a reminder of how individual crimes could reflect broader historical transformations affecting entire civilizations. The longships continued to sail the northern seas, carrying both traditional Norse values and new Christian influences to distant lands. The murder investigation had helped establish legal precedents that would guide future generations as they navigated the complex challenges of cultural and religious change in the medieval North. In story number 4, we visit year 847 AD, the scholar's last theorem, Baghdad, Abbasid Caliphate, March 847 AD. Qadi Ahmad ibn Hanbal stood in the marble courtyard of the House of Wisdom, watching the early morning light illuminate the greatest library and research center in the Islamic world. At 45, he served as one of Baghdad's most respected judges, responsible for investigating crimes that touched upon the complex religious, political, and intellectual life of the Abbasid capital. The message that had summoned him from his morning prayers carried news that threatened to shake the foundations of the scholarly community that made Baghdad the intellectual center of the known world. The parchment bore urgent script in classical Arabic. "Most honorable Qadi, we have discovered a most grievous matter at the House of Wisdom. The renowned mathematician and astronomer Abu Yusuf al-Kindi has been found dead in circumstances that suggest foul play. Given his prominence in the translation movement and his connections to the highest levels of government, this matter requires your personal attention." Abu Yusuf al-Kindi was indeed one of the most celebrated scholars of his generation, known throughout the Islamic world and beyond for his work in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. His translations of Greek philosophical texts and his original treatises had contributed significantly to the great intellectual synthesis that was transforming Islamic civilization. Baghdad in 847 was at the height of its glory under Caliph al-Wathiq, grandson of the legendary Harun al-Rashid. The city of nearly 2 million inhabitants was the largest urban center in the world, a cosmopolitan metropolis where Arab, Persian, Turkish, and other cultures mingled in a synthesis that produced unprecedented advances in science, philosophy, literature, and the arts. The House of Wisdom, established by Caliph al-Mamun a generation earlier, embodied this intellectual flowering. Here, scholars from across the known world worked to translate, preserve, and expand upon the knowledge of ancient Greece, Persia, India, and other civilizations. The library contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in Arabic, Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and other languages, making it the greatest repository of human knowledge in existence. Ahmad had served as a Qadi for 12 years, since completing his studies in Islamic law, philosophy, and literature at the prestigious Nizamiya school. His reputation for fairness and intellectual rigor had made him the preferred judge for cases involving scholars, merchants, and government officials whose activities required understanding of complex theological, legal, and political issues. The investigation would require navigating the intricate relationships between different schools of Islamic thought, the ongoing tensions between rationalist and traditionalist approaches to theology, and the political undercurrents that shaped intellectual life in the Abbasid court. Ahmad was met at the House of Wisdom by Ibrahim ibn Sinan, the chief librarian whose administrative skills and scholarly knowledge made him responsible for coordinating the work of dozens of translators, scribes, and researchers. Qadi Ahmad, this is a dark day for all who value learning and wisdom. Abu Yusuf was not only a great scholar, but a kind and generous man who helped many younger researchers in their work. Ibrahim, please describe the circumstances in which Abu Yusuf's body was discovered. I found him in his private study this morning when I came to discuss arrangements for a manuscript copying project. He was slumped over his writing desk, and there was blood on his robes and on the parchments he had been working on. Did you notice anything else unusual about the scene? Several of Abu Yusuf's mathematical treatises appeared to have been disturbed, and there was an ink bottle overturned as if there had been some kind of struggle. Who else had access to Abu Yusuf's private study? Only the most senior scholars and a few trusted assistants. Abu Yusuf was working on sensitive projects that required discretion and security. This suggested that the killer was someone with legitimate access to the House of Wisdom's restricted areas, indicating a person of scholarly standing or administrative authority. Ahmad examined the study carefully, noting details that might reveal the identity of the killer or the motive for the crime. The room was elegantly furnished with fine carpets, carved wooden furniture, and walls lined with carefully organized manuscripts and scientific instruments. Abu Yusuf's mathematical and astronomical calculations covered several tables, demonstrating the sophisticated work that had made him famous throughout the Islamic world. The scholar's body showed a single knife wound to the chest, inflicted with sufficient precision to suggest someone with knowledge of anatomy. But there were also signs of a struggle, including overturned inkwells and scattered papers that indicated Abu Yusuf had not been taken completely by surprise. Ibrahim, what was Abu Yusuf working on in his final days? What projects required such security and discretion? He was completing a major work on Aristotelian philosophy that reconciled Greek rational methods with Islamic theological principles. The work was controversial because it challenged some traditional interpretations of religious doctrine. This could provide motive for murder if religious conservatives had viewed Abu Yusuf's philosophical work as threatening to orthodox Islamic belief. Was he also involved in any government projects or political activities? Abu Yusuf served as an advisor to the caliph on matters involving astronomy and mathematics. He had been working on calendar calculations and astronomical observations that were used for religious and administrative purposes. What about his relationships with other scholars? Were there any significant disputes or rivalries? Abu Yusuf was generally well respected, but there had been some tensions with scholars who opposed the translation movement and who felt that too much emphasis was being placed on foreign learning at the expense of traditional Islamic scholarship. Ahmad's investigation began with examining Abu Yusuf's recent work and correspondence to understand the specific issues that might have created enemies. The scholar's papers revealed involvement in several potentially controversial projects. Most significantly, Abu Yusuf had been working on a treatise that attempted to demonstrate the compatibility between Aristotelian logic and Islamic theology. The work challenged traditional interpretations of certain Quranic passages and proposed new methods for understanding religious truth through rational inquiry. Ibrahim, who would have been most opposed to Abu Yusuf's philosophical work? There are scholars who believe that Greek philosophy corrupts Islamic thought. They feel that rational inquiry should be subordinated to traditional religious authority and that foreign learning poses a threat to the purity of Islamic civilization. Can you provide names of specific individuals who held such views? Ahmad ibn Hanbal, not to be confused with yourself, Kadi, is a prominent traditionalist scholar who has been critical of the rationalist approach. There is also Dawood ibn Ali, who leads a school of thought that emphasizes literal interpretation of religious texts. Both of these men were indeed influential scholars whose opposition to Abu Yusuf's work could have provided motive for murder if they viewed his philosophical activities as seriously threatening to Islamic orthodoxy. Ahmad's first interview was with Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the traditionalist scholar whose name he shared. The interview took place at ibn Hanbal's residence near the Great Mosque, a modest building that reflected the scholar's emphasis on simple living and traditional values. Ibn Hanbal was a man of 60 with the ascetic appearance and intense manner of someone who had devoted his life to religious study and teaching. His library was filled with collections of hadith and traditional Islamic texts, in contrast to the diverse philosophical and scientific works that characterize the House of Wisdom. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the death of Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, is a loss to the entire scholarly community, regardless of our differences in approach. Indeed, Qadi Ahmad, while I disagreed with some of Abu Yusuf's methods, I respected his sincerity and his dedication to learning. What were the nature of your disagreements with his philosophical work? I felt that Abu Yusuf placed too much emphasis on Greek rational methods and not enough on traditional Islamic sources of knowledge. Philosophy should serve religion, not challenge or replace it. Did you view his work as dangerous to Islamic orthodoxy? I worry that his approach could lead believers away from proper submission to divine revelation. Rational inquiry has its place, but it must be guided by religious authority. Did you ever discuss these concerns with Abu Yusuf directly? We had several debates about these matters, both in private and in public forums. Abu Yusuf was always respectful and thoughtful in his responses, even when we disagreed fundamentally. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, where were you last night when Abu Yusuf was killed? At home with my family, working on a commentary on hadith traditions. My wife and students can confirm my presence throughout the evening. Despite his philosophical opposition to Abu Yusuf's work, ibn Hanbal seemed genuinely saddened by the scholar's death and showed no signs of personal animosity that might motivate murder. Dawood ibn Ali proved to be a more complex figure. The leader of the Zahiri school of Islamic jurisprudence, he advocated for strictly literal interpretation of religious texts and opposed the use of analogical reasoning in legal and theological matters. Dawood received Ahmad at his teaching center, a building where students from across the Islamic world came to study his distinctive approach to Islamic law and theology. The scholar was a man of 50 with the confident manner of someone accustomed to intellectual combat and theological controversy. Qadi Ahmad, Abu Yusuf's death is indeed tragic, though I cannot say I am surprised by this development. What do you mean by that? Dawood ibn Ali, Abu Yusuf's involvement with foreign philosophical systems had made him enemies among those who value traditional Islamic purity. His work threatened the established religious authorities. Are you suggesting that he was killed for religious reasons? I am suggesting that intellectual arrogance often leads to dangerous consequences. Abu Yusuf believed that human reason could solve problems that should be left to divine revelation. Did you consider his work blasphemous or heretical? I considered it misguided and potentially harmful to the faith of ordinary believers who might be confused by complex philosophical arguments. Dawood ibn Ali, did you ever threaten Abu Yusuf or warn him about the dangers of his philosophical activities? I may have suggested that he should be more careful about the implications of his work, but I never threatened him with violence. Where were you when Abu Yusuf was murdered? Teaching an evening class on Quranic interpretation. Many students can confirm my presence. While Dawood's opposition to Abu Yusuf's work was clear, his alibi seemed solid, and his manner suggested intellectual rather than physical confrontation. Ahmad's investigation took a different direction when he learned that Abu Yusuf had been involved in a dispute with a wealthy merchant who had commissioned mathematical calculations for a major trading venture. Jafar ibn Yahya was one of Baghdad's most successful merchants, with trading networks that extended from Spain to India. His business required sophisticated mathematical calculations for currency exchange, profit calculations, and navigation, making scholars like Abu Yusuf valuable commercial consultants. Ahmad found Jafar at his counting house in the merchant quarter, surrounded by clerks and account books that reflected the complexity of international medieval commerce. Jafar ibn Yahya, I understand you had business dealings with the late Abu Yusuf al-Kindi. Abu Yusuf performed mathematical calculations for several of my trading ventures. His work was essential for managing the complexities of international commerce. What was the nature of your most recent business with him? I had commissioned him to develop new methods for calculating profit margins on long-distance trading expeditions. The work involved complex mathematical formulas that could account for currency fluctuations and transportation costs. Were there any disputes about his calculations or his fees? Jafar hesitated before answering. There were some disagreements about the accuracy of certain calculations that had resulted in financial losses for one of my expeditions. What kind of financial losses? Abu Yusuf's calculations had underestimated the costs of a trading voyage to India, resulting in losses of several thousand dinars when actual expenses exceeded projected profits. Did you hold Abu Yusuf responsible for these losses? I felt that his mathematical errors had contributed to the financial problems, and I demanded compensation for the losses. How did Abu Yusuf respond to these demands? He claimed that the losses were due to unforeseen circumstances rather than mathematical errors, and he refused to provide compensation. This commercial dispute provided a clear financial motive for murder, especially given the substantial sums involved. Jafar ibn Yahya, where were you when Abu Yusuf was killed? At a business dinner with other merchants, discussing arrangements for the spring trading season. Several colleagues can confirm my presence. Despite the apparent alibi, Ahmad noted that wealthy merchants often had agents and employees who could carry out violent acts on their behalf. The investigation took another turn when Ahmad discovered that Abu Yusuf had been working on a secret project for the Caliph involving astronomical calculations that could have political implications. This information came from Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the chief translator at the House of Wisdom and one of the most respected scholars in Baghdad. Hunayn was an historian Christian whose linguistic skills and scholarly knowledge had made him indispensable to the translation movement. Qadi Ahmad Abu Yusuf was working on calculations related to astrological predictions for the caliph's military campaigns. What kind of astrological predictions? Determinations of favorable times for military actions based on astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. Such work is politically sensitive because it could influence major government decisions. Who else knew about this secret project? Very few people. The work was commissioned directly by the Caliph's private secretary and was conducted with great discretion. Could someone have killed Abu Yusuf to prevent these calculations from being completed or to steal the results? It's possible. Astrological predictions could be valuable to the Caliph's enemies if they revealed planned military operations or showed favorable times for rebellion. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, did Abu Yusuf express any concerns about threats to his safety? He mentioned receiving warnings from people who opposed his philosophical work, but he did not seem to take them seriously. What kind of warnings? Messages suggesting that his rationalist approach to theology was corrupting Islamic youth and that he should abandon his philosophical studies. This suggested that the murder might indeed have been motivated by religious extremism rather than commercial or political concerns. Ahmad's investigation revealed that Abu Yusuf had been receiving threatening letters from an anonymous source who claimed to represent defenders of the true faith. The letters warned that continued work on philosophical subjects would result in divine punishment or human intervention. Further investigation identified the source of these threats as a group of religious conservatives led by a firebrand preacher named Abu Bakr al-Tamimi, who had been organizing opposition to the translation movement and calling for a return to purely traditional Islamic scholarship. Al-Tamimi was a charismatic speaker who attracted crowds with his denunciations of foreign learning and his warnings about the corruption of Islamic civilization through Greek philosophy and other non-Islamic influences. Ahmad found Al-Tamimi at a mosque in Baghdad's traditional quarter, preparing for an evening sermon that would likely include attacks on the scholars at the House of Wisdom. Al-Tamimi was a man of 40 with the intense manner and rhetorical skills of a professional preacher. His simple clothing and austere manner contrasted sharply with the luxury and intellectual sophistication of the court scholars. Abu Bakr al-Tamimi, the death of Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, has shocked the scholarly community. What are your thoughts about this tragedy? I am saddened by any loss of human life, Qadi Ahmad, but I cannot say I am surprised that Abu Yusuf's dangerous activities have led to tragic consequences. What do you mean by dangerous activities? Abu Yusuf was corrupting the minds of young Muslims with foreign philosophical ideas that contradict the clear teachings of the Quran and Hadith. Did you consider his work heretical? I considered it harmful to the spiritual welfare of the Islamic community. Philosophy should serve religion, not challenge its fundamental principles. Did you send threatening letters to Abu Yusuf warning him to abandon his philosophical work? Al-Tamimi's expression became defensive. I may have sent messages encouraging him to focus on traditional Islamic scholarship rather than foreign learning. Were these messages threatening in nature? They were warnings about the spiritual dangers of his path, not threats of physical violence. Abu Bakr al-Tamimi, where were you when Abu Yusuf was murdered? Leading evening prayers at the mosque and then meeting with community leaders about religious education. Many people can confirm my presence. While al-Tamimi's opposition to Abu Yusuf's work was clear, his alibi seemed credible, and his demeanor suggested someone more interested in public preaching than private violence. The breakthrough in the case came when Ahmad discovered that one of Abu Yusuf's own students had been systematically copying and selling his mathematical and philosophical work to competing scholars and foreign governments. This information emerged when Ahmad found discrepancies between Abu Yusuf's private notes and certain manuscripts that had appeared in other collections. The copying was so sophisticated that it suggested someone with intimate access to the scholar's work and detailed knowledge of his methods. The trail led to Mahmud ibn Umar, a brilliant young mathematician who had been studying under Abu Yusuf for 3 years and who had been trusted with access to his most sensitive research. When confronted with evidence of the copying scheme, Mahmud initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed to both the intellectual theft and the murder. I never intended to kill my master, Mahmud admitted. I went to his study that night to retrieve some manuscripts I had been copying, but Abu Yusuf discovered me. What happened during the confrontation? Abu Yusuf was furious about my betrayal of his trust. He said he would report my theft to the authorities and ensure that I was expelled from the House of Wisdom. So you killed him to prevent exposure? I panicked. Abu Yusuf was not only my teacher, but like a father to me. The shame of disappointing him was unbearable, but the thought of losing my scholarly career was even worse. What were you planning to do with the stolen manuscripts? I had been selling copies to foreign buyers who were willing to pay substantial sums for access to Islamic, mathematical, and philosophical knowledge. Who were these buyers? Byzantine scholars, European monasteries, Indian mathematicians, anyone who valued the knowledge but could not gain direct access to the House of Wisdom. The confession revealed that Abu Yusuf had been killed not for his controversial philosophical work, but by someone he had trusted and mentored. The murder was a tragic betrayal that reflected the complex pressures facing young scholars in the competitive intellectual environment of Abbasid Baghdad. Mahmud's trial was conducted according to Islamic legal principles, with Ahmad serving as judge and a panel of legal scholars determining the appropriate punishment. The case highlighted complex issues involving intellectual property, academic ethics, and the appropriate punishment for crimes committed by scholars. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, noting that Mahmud had not only committed murder, but had also betrayed the trust of the scholarly community by stealing and selling intellectual property. The defense pleaded for mercy, emphasizing Mahmud's youth, his previous good character, and his genuine remorse for the crime. They argued that the murder had been unpremeditated and had resulted from panic rather than malicious intent. The court ultimately sentenced Mahmud to death for murder, but commuted the sentence to life imprisonment in recognition of his confession and cooperation with the investigation. He was also required to make financial restitution for the stolen manuscripts. The case established important precedents for dealing with crimes involving intellectual property and academic misconduct. It demonstrated that the Islamic legal system could adapt to address new types of crimes that emerged from the increasingly sophisticated scholarly culture of the Abbasid period. For the House of Wisdom, Abu Yusuf's murder served as a reminder of the need for better security procedures and more careful screening of students and assistants. New policies were implemented to protect sensitive research and prevent unauthorized copying of manuscripts. The investigation also revealed the international demand for Islamic scholarly work, highlighting the valuable intellectual contributions being made by Baghdad's scholars. The case demonstrated that Islamic learning was sought after throughout the known world, making it both a source of pride and a potential target for theft. Ahmad's handling of the case enhanced his reputation as a judge capable of understanding complex intellectual and cultural issues. His fair treatment of all parties involved helped maintain confidence in the Islamic legal system during a period of rapid social and cultural change. The murder also sparked discussions about the ethics of knowledge sharing and the balance between protecting intellectual property and promoting the spread of learning. These debates continued for generations and influenced the development of academic institutions throughout the Islamic world. In his final judgment, Ahmad wrote, "The murder of Abu Yusuf al-Kindi represents not only the loss of a great scholar, but a betrayal of the trust that makes intellectual progress possible. The Islamic community must protect both its scholars and its knowledge while remaining open to learning from all sources of wisdom." The case became part of the intellectual history of the Islamic Golden Age, serving as a cautionary tale about the pressures and temptations that could corrupt even the most promising young scholars. It reminded future generations that the pursuit of knowledge required not only intellectual ability, but also moral integrity and respect for the trust of teachers and colleagues. Abu Yusuf's scholarly legacy continued through his surviving works and the students who had learned from him honestly. His mathematical and philosophical contributions remained influential for centuries, while his tragic death served as a reminder of the human cost that sometimes accompanied intellectual achievement. The House of Wisdom continued to flourish for several more generations, serving as a beacon of learning and cultural synthesis until its destruction during the Mongol invasion of Baghdad in 1258. But the precedents established by Ahmad's investigation influenced Islamic legal and academic practices throughout the medieval period. The scholar's last theorem, as historians would later call the case, demonstrated that even in the most advanced intellectual environments, human weakness could lead to tragedy. But it also showed that careful investigation and fair justice could preserve the integrity of scholarly institutions and protect the pursuit of knowledge that made civilizations great. In the great city of Baghdad, where the wisdom of ages was preserved, translated, and expanded upon, the memory of Abu Yusuf al-Kindi and the lessons learned from his tragic death continued to inspire scholars who understood that knowledge was humanity's greatest treasure, worthy of protection at any cost. And the last story for tonight, number 5, The Pioneer's Last Stand, Oregon City, Oregon Territory, October 1846. Deputy Marshal William Hayes adjusted his woolen coat against the autumn chill as he rode through the muddy streets of Oregon City toward the territorial courthouse. At 34, he served as one of the few law enforcement officers in the vast Oregon Territory, responsible for investigating crimes across an area larger than most eastern states, but with a population of fewer than 10,000 American settlers scattered among native tribes, Hudson's Bay Company posts, and the rough communities that had sprung up along the Oregon Trail. The message that had summoned him from his patrol of the Willamette Valley was written in urgent script on paper that bore the watermarks of civilization carried across 2,000 miles of wilderness. Marshal Hayes, we have a situation at the Whitman mission that requires immediate investigation. Dr. Marcus Whitman has been found dead under circumstances that suggest murder. Given the tensions between settlers and the Cayuse tribe, this matter could affect the entire territory's stability. Dr. Marcus Whitman was indeed one of the most prominent figures in Oregon Territory, a missionary physician whose efforts to convert native tribes to Christianity and whose assistance to wagon trains along the Oregon Trail had made him both famous and controversial. His death could inflame the already tense relationships between American settlers, British traders, and the various native tribes whose lands were being transformed by westward migration. Oregon Territory in 1846 was a region in transition where the frontier collision of cultures created both opportunity and danger. The territory's population included American pioneers seeking new lives in the fertile valleys west of the Rocky Mountains, British traders maintaining fur trading operations established decades earlier, and numerous native tribes adapting to the rapid changes brought by increasing numbers of white settlers. Hayes had come to Oregon in 1843 with one of the first major wagon trains, served briefly as a territorial militia officer during conflicts with native tribes, and been appointed deputy marshal when civilian law enforcement became necessary to maintain order among the growing settler population. His work required understanding not only criminal investigation, but also the complex cultural and political dynamics that characterize frontier society. The case would be particularly sensitive because any conflict involving missionaries and native tribes could escalate into broader violence that might require federal military intervention and could affect the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Britain over the territory's final political status. The journey to the Whitman mission took Hayes through the heart of the Oregon Territory's agricultural region, where pioneer families had established farms along the rivers and valleys that made the territory attractive to settlers seeking fertile land unavailable in the increasingly crowded eastern states. The landscape reflected both the natural abundance that drew migrants west and the challenges of creating civilization in a region where traditional structures of law and order were still being established. The Whitman mission was located near present-day Walla Walla, in the territory's eastern region where the Columbia River provided both transportation and a boundary between different tribal territories. The mission complex included a house, medical clinic, school, and agricultural buildings that served both the Cayuse tribe and the wagon trains that stopped there for rest and supplies during their journey to the Willamette Valley. Hayes was met at the mission by Narcissa Whitman, the doctor's wife and a prominent figure in her own right, as one of the first white women to cross the Rocky Mountains and establish a permanent residence in the Oregon Territory. Narcissa was clearly distraught, but maintained the composure that had enabled her to survive over a decade of frontier life. Marshal Hayes, this is a terrible day for all who have worked to bring Christian civilization to this wilderness. Marcus was not only my husband, but a dedicated servant of both God and the many people who depended on his medical skills. Mrs. Whitman, please accept my condolences for your loss. I must ask you to describe the circumstances in which Dr. Whitman's body was discovered. I found Marcus in his medical clinic early this morning when I came to prepare medicines for the day's patients. He was lying on the floor near his surgical instruments, and there was blood on his clothing and on the medical supplies. Did you notice anything else unusual about the scene? The clinic appeared to have been searched, and some of Dr. Whitman's medical supplies were missing, along with certain documents related to his correspondence with territorial officials. This suggested that the killer had been looking for specific items rather than simply murdering the doctor, indicating possible motives involving Dr. Whitman's medical practice or his political activities. Who else had access to the medical clinic? Marcus treated patients from many different groups: members of the Cayuse tribe, other missionaries, settlers passing through on the Oregon Trail, and occasional traders or territorial officials. Hayes examined the clinic carefully, noting details that might reveal the identity of the killer or the motive for the crime. The building was well equipped by frontier standards, with medical instruments, surgical supplies, and pharmaceutical preparations that reflected Dr. Whitman's training as a physician and his years of experience treating everything from gunshot wounds to epidemic diseases. Dr. Whitman's body showed evidence of both knife wounds and blunt force trauma, suggesting that he had been attacked by someone strong enough to overpower a healthy man and experienced enough with violence to inflict fatal injuries quickly. The missing medical supplies included laudanum, morphine, and other drugs that could be valuable either for treating injuries or for trading with native tribes or other frontier inhabitants who had limited access to such medicines. Mrs. Whitman, what was your husband working on in recent days? Were there any disputes or controversies that might have created enemies? Marcus had been involved in several matters that were causing tensions. He had been corresponding with territorial officials about problems with some of the settlers who were claiming lands without proper authority. He was also concerned about increasing conflicts between different native tribes that were being displaced by white settlement. Both issues could provide motives for murder if Dr. Whitman's interventions had threatened the interests of land speculators, illegal settlers, or tribal leaders who viewed his influence as problematic. What about his medical practice? Had he been treating anyone whose condition might have created disputes? Marcus had been treating several people whose cases involved difficult decisions about resources and priorities. There was Joseph Meek, the mountain man who had been seriously injured and required expensive medicines. There was also Chief Tilu Kite of the Cayuse, whose son had died despite Marcus's treatment. Both cases could have created resentment if the patients or their families blamed Dr. Whitman for outcomes that were beyond his control, or if they viewed his treatment decisions as unfair or inadequate. Hayes decided to begin his investigation by interviewing the key figures who had been involved in recent disputes or controversies surrounding Dr. Whitman's activities. His first meeting was with Joseph Meek, the legendary mountain man, whose knowledge of the territory and relationships with various native tribes had made him an influential figure in frontier society. Meek was a man of 46 with the scarred hands and weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades living in the wilderness as a trapper, trader, and occasional guide for wagon trains. His cabin near the mission reflected both his frontier lifestyle and his status as someone who had accumulated wealth through successful adaptation to territorial conditions. Marshall Hayes. Doc Whitman's death is a real loss for everyone in this territory. He was one of the few men who could work with both whites and Indians and keep some kind of peace between all the different groups. Joe, I understand Dr. Whitman had been treating you for serious injuries. How did you feel about the care you received? Doc did everything he could for me, used up expensive medicines, and spent a lot of time on my case. I was grateful for his help, even though the treatment was painful and didn't work as well as we hoped. Were there any disputes about payment or the costs of your treatment? I paid what I could, but frontier medicine is expensive, and Doc sometimes had to choose between treating people who could pay and people who needed help more urgently. Did such choices create tensions with other patients or their families? Some folks felt that Doc favored certain groups over others, or that he was too generous with expensive medicines for people who couldn't contribute much to the mission's work. Joe, where were you when Dr. Whitman was killed? At my cabin, recovering from my injuries and preparing for a trading expedition to Fort Vancouver. My wife can confirm that I was too weak to travel far from home. Despite his apparent alibi, Meek's knowledge of frontier violence and his access to the mission made him a potential suspect who would need further investigation. Hayes's next interview was with Chief Tilukite of the Cayuse tribe, whose relationship with Dr. Whitman had been complicated by both successful medical treatments and tragic failures that had affected tribal attitudes toward white settlement. The chief was a man of perhaps 50 with the dignified bearing and careful manner of someone who had been navigating the dangerous waters of white Indian relations for many years. His village was located near the mission, reflecting the complex interdependence that had developed between the Cayuse and the missionary community. Chief Tilukite, Dr. Whitman's death affects not only his family, but all who knew him as a healer and teacher. The white doctor tried to help our people, but his medicine was not always successful. My son died despite the doctor's treatment, and some of my people blamed the white man's medicine for the death. Did you hold Dr. Whitman responsible for your son's death? I understood that the doctor did his best, but grief makes people angry, and they look for someone to blame when loved ones die. Were there members of your tribe who wanted revenge against Dr. Whitman? Some young warriors felt that the white doctor's failures proved that his medicine was harmful to our people, but I counseled patience and understanding. Chief, did Dr. Whitman's medical practice create other problems between your people and the white settlers? The doctors sometimes treated white patients differently than Indian patients, giving better medicines or more attention to those who could pay or who shared his religion. How did your people respond to such treatment? With anger and suspicion, when people are sick and desperate, they notice any sign that they are being treated unfairly. Chief Tilukite, where were you when Dr. Whitman was murdered? In my village, meeting with tribal elders about our response to increasing white settlement in our traditional territories. Many people can confirm my presence. While the chief's alibi seemed credible, the tensions he described between the Cayuse and Dr. Whitman provided clear motives for tribal members who might have decided that violence was necessary to address their grievances. The investigation took a different direction when Hayes learned that Dr. Whitman had been involved in a dispute with James Douglas, the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company's Columbia River operations, over the treatment of British employees and the allocation of medical resources between American and British interests in the territory. Douglas was one of the most powerful men in the Oregon Territory, representing British commercial and political interests, during a period when the final boundary between American and British territories was still being negotiated. His headquarters at Fort Vancouver served as both a trading post and a center of British influence in the region. Hayes found Douglas at the fort, an impressive complex that reflected the Hudson's Bay Company's long-established presence in the territory and its sophisticated understanding of both native relations and international commerce. Douglas was a man of 43 with a cultivated manner and expensive clothing that marked him as a representative of British imperial interests. His office was filled with maps, trade goods, and correspondence that demonstrated the company's extensive network throughout the Pacific Northwest. Marshall Hayes, Dr. Whitman's death is indeed unfortunate. He was a skilled physician whose services were valuable to all inhabitants of the territory, regardless of their national allegiances. Mr. Douglas, I understand there had been some tensions between Dr. Whitman and the Hudson's Bay Company over medical services and resource allocation. We had occasional disagreements about the proper distribution of medical care and the allocation of pharmaceutical supplies between different communities in the territory. What was the nature of these disagreements? Dr. Whitman sometimes prioritized American settlers over British employees or native tribes that had traditional relationships with our company. Did such priorities create significant problems for British operations? They occasionally complicated our relationships with native tribes and made it more difficult to maintain the stability that successful trading operations require. Mr. Douglas, did you consider Dr. Whitman's policies harmful to British interests in the territory? I felt that his approach was sometimes unnecessarily divisive, but I respected his right to make medical decisions according to his own judgment. Where were you when Dr. Whitman was killed? At Fort Vancouver, meeting with company representatives who had arrived from London with new instructions about our territorial operations. Several employees can confirm my presence. While Douglas's alibi seemed solid, his position as head of British interests made him a potential suspect who could have arranged for the murder to be carried out by employees or native allies. The breakthrough in the case came when Hayes discovered that someone had been stealing medical supplies from Dr. Whitman's clinic and selling them to illegal whiskey traders who used the drugs to create more potent and dangerous alcoholic beverages for trade with native tribes. This discovery emerged when he found evidence of systematic theft in the clinic's inventory records, with expensive medicines disappearing at regular intervals over several months. The stolen supplies included not only valuable pharmaceuticals, but also surgical instruments and other medical equipment that could be traded for substantial profits in a region where such items were scarce and expensive. Further investigation revealed that the theft operation was being conducted by Tom McKay, a mixed-blood trader who had been using his access to the mission and his relationships with various native tribes to create a profitable black market in medical supplies. McKay was the son of a Scottish trader and a native woman, giving him cultural connections that allowed him to move freely between white and Indian communities while avoiding the scrutiny that pure-blood members of either group might face. When confronted with evidence of the theft operation, McKay initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed to both the systematic stealing and the murder of Dr. Whitman. I never meant to kill the doc, McKay admitted. I'd been taking medicines and instruments for months without him noticing, but recently he'd started keeping better track of his supplies. What happened on the night you killed him? I went to the clinic to take some laudanum and surgical tools that I'd already promised to traders. But Doc Whitman was working late and caught me in the act. How did he respond to discovering your theft? He was furious and said he was going to report me to the territorial authorities and make sure I was prosecuted for stealing medicines that were needed to help sick people. So you decided to kill him to prevent exposure? I panicked. If Doc had reported my activities, I would have faced serious legal problems and my trading relationships would have been destroyed. How did you kill Dr. Whitman? We fought when he tried to stop me from leaving with the supplies. I hit him with a surgical instrument and then stabbed him when he continued to resist. What did you do with the stolen medical supplies? I took everything I could carry and delivered it to my trading partners as planned. The medicines were too valuable to waste, even after the murder. The confession revealed that Dr. Whitman had been killed not for his religious or political activities, but for his efforts to protect medical supplies that were desperately needed by his patients. The investigation also exposed the sophisticated black market networks that operated on the frontier, where legitimate goods could be stolen and sold to illegal traders who exploited the scarcity of manufactured items in remote territories. The trial of Tom McKay was conducted according to territorial legal procedures, with a jury of settlers determining guilt and appropriate punishment. The case highlighted complex issues involving mixed race identity, cultural loyalty, and economic opportunity on the frontier. The prosecution argued that McKay had betrayed the trust of both white and Native communities by stealing medicines needed for treating sick people and by murdering a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. The defense claimed that McKay's actions had been motivated by economic desperation and cultural confusion rather than malicious intent, and that his mixed heritage had made it difficult for him to find legitimate opportunities for advancement. The jury ultimately convicted McKay of murder and sentenced him to death, but the territorial governor commuted the sentence to life imprisonment in recognition of the complex cultural factors that had contributed to his criminal behavior. The case established important precedents for protecting medical resources and maintaining the trust that made frontier medical practice possible in communities where doctors were scarce and medical supplies were precious. For the Oregon Territory, Dr. Whitman's murder highlighted the challenges of maintaining law and order in a region where traditional social structures were still being established and where cultural conflicts could escalate to violence. Hayes's investigation enhanced his reputation as a law enforcement officer capable of solving complex crimes while understanding the cultural sensitivities that characterize frontier society. The case also demonstrated the importance of protecting the individuals and institutions that provided essential services to frontier communities, regardless of their religious or political affiliations. The territorial government used the investigation to implement new security procedures for medical facilities and to establish better coordination between civilian law enforcement and military authorities responsible for maintaining order on the frontier. In his final report, Hayes wrote, "The murder of Dr. Whitman demonstrates that frontier justice must protect those who serve the common good of all inhabitants, regardless of their race, religion, or national origin. The territory's development depends upon maintaining the trust and cooperation that makes civilization possible in the wilderness." The case became part of Oregon Territory's legal history, serving as an example of how careful investigation could resolve complex crimes while preserving the cultural balance that made that peaceful development possible. Dr. Whitman's medical work was continued by other physicians who implemented new security measures while maintaining the mission's commitment to serving all members of the territory's diverse population. The investigation had revealed the sophisticated criminal networks that could develop on the frontier, where the scarcity of legitimate economic opportunities created incentives for illegal activities that exploited the needs of isolated communities. Narcissa Whitman continued to serve the mission community and became an advocate for better law enforcement and medical security throughout the territory. Her experience with the investigation made her a valuable advisor to other frontier families facing similar challenges. The case also influenced the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Britain over the territory's political status, as both governments recognized the need for stable institutions that could protect the rights and safety of all inhabitants, regardless of their national allegiances. Hayes continued to serve as a deputy marshal for many more years, investigating cases that ranged from simple theft to complex cultural conflicts. But the Whitman case remained one of his most challenging, a reminder that frontier justice required not only solving crimes, but also understanding the cultural and economic forces that created conditions for violence. The pioneer's last stand had been a tragic end to the life of a man who had dedicated himself to serving others. But the investigation had helped establish legal precedents and security procedures that would protect future generations of frontier medical practitioners and their patients. In the vast Oregon Territory, where wilderness was slowly giving way to civilization, the memory of Dr. Whitman and the lessons learned from his murder continued to influence those who understood that the frontier's greatest achievements came not from individual heroism, but from the cooperation and trust that made community life possible in the most challenging circumstances. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this: some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.